In this video, you're going to use local storage and lifecycle methods to save our options and refresh them when the user comes back. That's going to allow us to persist the options between page loads. Now let's explore the very basics of local storage before getting too far ahead of ourselves. Right here, we can explore local storage, and it's important to note that local storage, it's just a key value store. So we can name a key like name, we can give it a value like Andrew, and later on we can fetch the value Andrew based off of the key name. So for example, local storage dot set item. This is how we set a given item. We're going to be using quite a few methods on the local storage object. Set item takes two arguments, your key and your value. So the key could be something like name, and the value can be something like Andrew. Now, when we do this, we are going to actually be storing something inside of local storage, and we're going to be able to fetch that out later on. We can even fetch it out after a full page refresh. For now, though, we're just going to use local storage dot get item. And this time around, we just pass in one argument. We pass in the key name, and the value, that's what comes back as the return argument. So right here, we're getting Andrew printing. Now, if I were to refresh the page and reload the last command using the up key and rerun it, you can see we're still getting Andrew. So local storage is going to persist between page loads, which is going to make it a really great starter database mechanism. We'll worry about real databases later. For now, this is going to let us explore all of the general principles. So from here, what can we do with local storage? Well, we can remove items, local storage dot remove item. And we remove an item by its key. So I can remove name, for example, and the next time I try to fetch it, you can see we get null back. So local storage allows us to do a lot of interesting things, but it's important to note that local storage only works with string data. Even if I were to try to save a number, it would actually implicitly convert it over to a string. So if I were to use local storage dot set item, and I were to try to set age equal to the number 26, it would technically work. The call does seem to work. No errors show up to the screen. But if I use local storage.get item to fetch the age, we're going to see that the return result is actually the string 26, not the number 26. So it's important to note that local storage only works with string data. Now, how exactly are we going to work with objects and arrays? These are the kind of things that we want to store. We don't want to store just regular strings or numbers. I want to store the entire options array so I can grab it later on. Well, to do that, we're just going to use JSON data. JSON is just a string representation of a JavaScript object or an array, and it stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Now, the format is slightly different, but in principle, it's exactly the same thing. So let's mess around with that. I'm going to refresh the application, clearing out the console, and we're going to use JSON.stringify. So there's two JSON methods we're going to be using. JSON.stringify is going to take a regular JavaScript object and get the string representation, and JSON.parse is going to take the string representation and return a true JavaScript object. So right here, we're going to start with stringify. I'm going to stringify some sort of object. In this case, it would be our options array. For the moment, we can just go ahead and create an object where age equals some sort of number. Now, when we do this, the return value, that's going to be the string representation of that object. And you'll notice that it looks pretty similar. The big difference is that all of the keys, they are wrapped in double quotes, and that is one of the many rules that JSON enforces. Now, the details of this string really aren't important. We're never going to be manually working with it. It's this string, though, that we are going to save to local storage. Later on, we're going to fetch it, and we're going to do something meaningful with it. So for the moment, let's just go ahead and rerun that command. But at the very beginning, we're going to store the data in a const lowercase j JSON. Now we have access to it. Right here, we get our string representation of that object. Now if we go ahead and use JSON.parse, we can take this string and convert it back into a real JavaScript object. So JSON.parse, we're going to be parsing that string. And when we do, we get a real object back. We can store that object in a variable. We can even access the properties like age right here, which prints 26. So by using local storage and the JSON methods, we're going to be able to save our array and fetch it back. Now let's go ahead and actually implement this inside of the application itself. And to kick things off, we are going to be saving the data. So right here, we're going to be using json.stringify and local storage.set item. Now, before we use either of those two, I want to add an if condition because there are only some situations where I actually want to save the data. To prove this, let's go ahead and head back to the application and click remove all. You'll notice that we get saving data. We click it again, we get saving data again. Every single time we click it, that method refires. And we know that every single time it's still just an empty array. So if we didn't add any if conditional inside of here, we would be saving redundant data. We would be saving data that already exists inside of the database. Now, component did update. It is going to fire even if those updates do not result in a change. So changing the state from an empty array to a new empty array that is considered a change, component did update will fire. All we're going to do is use an if condition to actually check if the options array length changed. So right here, if the previous state, which is just our old state object, .options.length has a different length than the current one, this .state.options.length, then and only then do we actually want to save the data. So we can take our log, we can put it inside of here, and then we can see what happens when we actually mess around with the app. So once again, I'm going to jam remove all, and you see that the message doesn't show up at all. It is going to show up correctly though if I add data, and if I'm actually changing the data when I click remove all, it will actually run saving data. It's just not going to run it if the data doesn't change. If the length is the same, there's no need to re-save. So how are we going to save? Right here, we're going to use the two tools we just explored. First up, we're going to make a const JSON, and we're going to be using uppercase JSON dot stringify. That's going to take our object and convert it over into a string. In this case, we're going to be passing in our array, this dot state dot options. So now we have a string representation, which we can store in local storage, and that's going to happen right here. Local storage dot set item. And now we just need to pick a key. We can use anything we like. I'm going to use options, and then we just pass in our data. Right here, we have that in the JSON variable. If we go ahead and save app.js, we're halfway done. We are going to be saving the data to local storage every single time it changes. Now, if I go ahead and add an item, I'm going to add 1, 2, and 3. We can take a peek at local storage and make sure the data updated. Local storage dot get item, and we are going to get options. So this is going to read that value out of local storage, and what do we get back? We get back a string representation of the object we just set up. So this is half of the battle. Now all we need to do is figure out how to read that data in and actually use this .set state to set the state based off of whatever data is sitting inside local storage. Right here, we can remove our console.log, and I'm going to replace it with a const. We're going to call this one JSON once again, and this time we're going to be reading it from local storage. That'll be local storage.get item, and we are trying to get the value for options, the one that we set down below. Now, once we have the JSON, we want to get a real JavaScript array back. We're going to use const to store that. We'll call this one options, and we're going to set it equal to json.parse. Make sure to get the capitalization correct, otherwise the method will not work. And inside of here, we are just going to pass in the JSON data that we'd like to parse. So now we have a real array back, and we can do something with it, like use this .set state to set it. Right here, this .set state, we are going to pass in our updater function. We're going to put our arrow, and then we are going to implicitly return an object. What do we want to return? We just want to return an object that updates options to the options array. And we already know we can use the shorthand object definition for that. We have a property whose value is coming from a variable with the same name. So this is identical. Now, if we go ahead and save app.js, the browser is going to restart, and you'll notice that our data did not go away. If I remove an item and I manually refresh the browser, when we come back, the data is still in place. That is because we are successfully fetching it out of local storage and using this .set state to get it showing up to the screen once again. Now, there are a couple of edge cases we have not handled. For example, what if there is no valid data inside of options? We can go ahead and see what would happen there. I'm going to use local storage .clear, that is going to clear every single value in all of local storage. All key value pairs get wiped. Now we can go ahead and use local storage .get item. We're going to get options. And what do we get back? We get back null. Now, what happens if we were to pass null into json.parse, which is exactly what we would be doing? We get back null once again. So if there is nothing in here, we obviously don't want to use this .set state to set options equal to null. Instead, we just want to do nothing. Now, we're going to use a little if statement to get that done. If and only if there are options, we will actually use this .set state. If options is null, we're going to go ahead and avoid calling this .set state. We'll just let the default state, the empty array, be the value. Now, the other alternative is if the data inside of options isn't valid JSON. In the browser, for example, we can try to use json.parse. In here, we are going to dump some stuff in. I'm going to open up an array. I will type the number 12, and then I'll close some curly braces. Clearly not valid JSON. And when I do that, you can see an error actually gets thrown. So if there is bad data inside of there, for whatever reason, we want to make sure to catch this error so it doesn't crash our program. And we're going to use try catch to get that done. Regular JavaScript try catch. We're going to try some code. We are going to catch any errors. Now the code we want to try is all of this stuff right here. So I'm going to take all of this and I'm going to paste it right inside of try. So it's going to try to run that code. If it runs well, that's awesome. If it throws an error because the JSON data is not valid, we're going to be able to catch that error and do something. Now, what do we want to do? We want to do nothing at all. If the JSON data is invalid, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to once again fall back to the empty array, which is the default value. So that means we're only going to use this .set state if it is valid JSON and if it actually exists, if it's not just null. Now that we have all of the edge cases handled, our application is going to work as expected. We're going to be able to add those items in 1, 2, 3, and we're going to be able to refresh the screen and see all of them show up once again. Before we go, I do want to make two small tweaks. The first tweak is way down at the bottom of the program inside of our add option component. Right now, we always set the error and clear the error, which is great. If there is no error that comes back, we're going to clear it. If there is one, we're going to set it. But I also want to clear the input. And I only want to clear the input if there wasn't an error. If the user did submit the form with an error, we don't want to just wipe the data. We'll just give them another chance to submit it. So right here, if there was no error, we will clear the input. Now that means we have to access the exact same element, e.target.elements.option. On there, we are going to set value equal to an empty string. That is going to ensure that when we actually do submit the valid data, the input gets wiped. Right here, my other item, I hit enter, the input gets cleaned away, and the item does indeed show up. So that is one of the tweaks I wanted to make. The other tweak right here inside of options is to add a little message when there is no data. So when that options array is empty, we want to render a little paragraph to the screen. That's an easy one, and we've done that one before. I'm just going to knock this out real quick. We're going to access props.options.length. If the length is equal to 0, then and only then do we want to show our message. I'll use the logical and operator to show the following paragraph. And we'll just type a little string in. Please add an option to get started. Perfect. Now, if we save this, we should see that message show up when there are no options. Remove all, everything goes away, and we've saved the empty array. So when I refresh, all that data really is gone. As we add the data back in though and refresh again, it does indeed show up. And we were able to do all of this using local storage. So that is our current storage technique. It is going to get us by until we explore how to work with a real database. That is it for this one. I'll see you next time.